We kick off with a theoretical panel for which we've lined up eminent speakers, the first of whom will be Professor Wolfgang Ernst, whom you already met yesterday. He moderated the first theoretical panel. Wolfgang Ernst teaches media theory at Humboldt University, and he's the director of the Institute of Musicology and Media Studies. He's written Das Rumoren des der Archive, Ordnung aus Unordnung, among others. And the second speaker will be Nina Lager-Wurstberg, who teaches visual culture at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. She's a founding member of visual culture in Europe with Andrea Günther, who's sitting right next to her and who will be delivering his presentation afterwards. She's written Robert Doisneau and the Making of a Universal Cliché. And then we'll have a contribution from Professor André Günther, who is a professor at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, as well as the director of Laboratoire d'Histoire Visuelle Contemporaine. He founded Études Photographiques, and now let's begin with the first panel.
Good morning. The Archival Act is the gesture of setting apart records from the immediate operativity called the present in order to store matter, energy, or information for later reuse. But against all metaphors of so-called collective memory, the archive is not about remembrance, but a cold administrative and juridical memory. The power of memory now takes place technologically. To resist the hallucinatory temptations of historical and cultural discourse when being in touch with the archive is the virtue of the media archaeological gaze. While in contemporary Japan, a provisionary hall of remembrance collects the wet photographies rescued from the ruins of the towns devastated or destroyed by the recent tsunami. In the United States, there is a huge image archive located in the Iron Mountain in Pennsylvania. Bill Gates' Corbis Corporation there keeps the physical photographies and negatives which it commercializes by digital distribution and rights. In the cold technical language, memory is nothing but a metaphor for storage, which is not about remembrance, but simply a function of addresses. The archive is a mnemonic agency, for sure. The term mnemonic here refers to the act of memory in its technological sense, while remembrance is an active energy which drives archival evidence outside the archive. Such memories are functional techniques. Their temporal index is arbitrary. What is being retrieved in technical memories is not the past, but as present as anything else around us. There, the emphatic temporalities of what we call the past or the future are being replaced by almost immediate retentions and protensions based on immediate intermediary memories. Medium, the in-between, in a radically temporal sense, close to the chronologics of electronic and neuronal circuits. At that point, I really have to apologize to the translators. This is a dense sentence for sure. Even I have difficulties to understand this reading it. In mid-19th century, the spreading photographization of the world resulted in a massive collection which was soon conceived to be arranged into bibliographic categories. The order of photography oscillated between the archival and the library function. But let us maintain the traditional conceptual and institutional difference between library, archive, and museum. A library is free to collect and to select, while the archive, by laws which oblige records to be deposited, are built from regulated input which can only be selected on the threshold of permanent storage. Both in archives and in libraries, information is organized so that it may be refound. But different from the open policy of collecting and selection in libraries, archives are strictly rule-governed, administratively programmed systems. Should we better speak of libraries of photography, of the photothek? The archive keeps unique, singular records like daguerreotypies. The library keeps multiple, mass-reproduced printed documents like the Talbot type. So when we talk about the photographic archive, I think in most cases we actually talk about library collections. The archive is different. In public discourse and cultural analysis, the notion of the archive, which is a bit inflammatory now, is closely associated with memory, even with history. But when we look at the genealogy of archives in history itself, they turn out to have been originating in a functional necessity to keep legal claims of rulers, of states, in latency for action. Rather a kind of cache memory in administration place of cultural memory. So you see, I want to set apart the idea of the archive from the idea of collective memory. For a long time, the politics of the archive has not primarily aimed at serving collective and cultural memory, but to act as an internal juridical memory of local or general government. Archives are less concerned with memory than with setting apart records which can be even eliminated after their functional usage. Now I'm talking about the archive in the strict sense, not about the archive as metaphor, as you realize. On the symbolical level, which is the level of ordering, we might ask, what kind of records are kept in the archive in order to be preserved for posterity? Indeed, the power of the archive is less in what it contains, but in what has been excluded, the criteria of the cybernetic door. The philosopher Hegel, around 1800, made a clear analytical distinction between human remembrance, Erinnerung, and technical memory, Gedächtnis. Let us not primarily face this question on the level of memory discourse, of cultural memory as a function of media representations, which would only be the surface, the interface appearance of media memory. But let us rather take the media immanent, media archaeological perspective. And here I take the expression of the Archaeology of Photography Foundation very literally. There is a world of difference between mechanical or electronic storage on the one hand, the world of the symbolical, which is the traditional written scriptural record archive, and imaginary memory, respectively human remembrance. let us not mix these three different regimes. The archive is not about semantic memory or storage as technology, but rather an organizational form, a well-defined system, a format of symbolic order by metadating, a rule materially non-invasive to its objects. As soon as we do not confuse remembrance with memory anymore, we get access to the archive in Foucault's sense. The emphatic notion of memory itself dissolves into the mechanism and cybernetics of storage. According to Foucault, the archive is the first law of what can be said, the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events. But the archive is also that which determines that all these things said do not accumulate endlessly in an amorphous mass, nor are they inscribed in an unbroken linearity, but they are grouped together in distinct figures, which actually means the idea to archive everything is very non-archival. Traditional archival self-consciousness means both spatial and temporal separation from the actual presence, a kind of latency. Such latency provides a temporal shelter against immediate consummation, a chronotemporal uneconomy, and a guarantee against permanent transformation, preserving the monument. In sharp contrast to the traditional archive, with the World Wide Web at large, reverberating circuits gain dominance over memory involving records. The internet is a circulation of discrete states without a central agency and an organized memory. Yet, archives are still vital to the functioning of the apparently unarchival world. When using a search engine like Google, one is actually not searching the net, but searching documents that have been crawled, that is, compressed and prefixed in the Google repository by doc ID, length, and URL before being indexed according to Google's secret formula. There the new archive is. The whole Google's architecture is reminiscent of an archive. But this is not the classical archive anymore, but a processual one with the PageRank algorithm regenerating the ranking and retrieval information according to statistical and referential values and weighting on the genotypical level. There is still a rule-governed, programmed system which organizes information so that it may be retrieved. But different to the traditional archive, this new archival inventory is updated and indeed reconfigured at an incredible speed. In the Deleuzian terminology and rereading of Foucault, the archive represents a kind of diagram. A multimedia archive, in addition, represents an operative diagram, a diagrammatic machine, which is still topologically arranged in its organization by graphs and nodes, but with the additional dimension of temporal dynamics, which again is a sharp difference to the traditional archive. Temporal dynamics was not part of the traditional archive. Intermediary electronic archives increasingly replace the institutional immobile archive. But when the archive becomes subject to time-critical reconfigurations, it loses its traditional definition as permanent working memory of a state in its abstract or concrete sense. When the archives become an intermediary memory, a transitory memory, it is not separated but directly coupled with the operative procedures of a given presence, involved in just-in-time or even real-time processing, thus tending more to the register, a temporary deposition, than to the end archive in the traditional sense. From the World Wide Web, on almost any occasion, images can be retrieved, at least from professional image agencies. That is why newspapers less and less provide for their own internal photographic archive. But in certain contexts, such an internal archive is needed, both in respect to authenticity and quality. The internet has been designed for being used immediately. It cannot pay respect to the materiality, thus immobility and physical resistance, of the traditional archival record. If digital virtualization and informatization is the signature of the current media culture, it is less archival than ever. The old institutional archive served as a bedrock against the complete mobilization of records, as opposed to distributed digital archives with open access in the internet of today. With intelligent addressing of digital images, an ever-transforming set of addressing records is possible once they exist in digital, that is, mathematized space. Not fixed metadata only, but permanent metamorphosis. At that point, the focus shifts from the analysis of the traditional archive records as being represented in the digital world to the new kind of archive which emerged within the internet, its protocols, as we learned from Alexander Galloway. While the old archive becomes a mere simulacrum in the digital world and dissolves into dynamic, permanent reordering, a new permanent or at least stable archive of rules has emerged, but hidden to the users. Now, is photography an archival medium at all, or is photography archival by its very nature? Photography relates to the archive in many ways. It is embedded in the archive as part of an extended record function. The archive is embedded in the photograph itself when, for example, photography is used for surveillance practices, such as biometric picturing. The archive seems to share its indexical character with photography itself, which might turn out to be a structural analogy. As mathematical functions of the alphanumeric code, digital photographies can be pixel-wise addressed and thus become an archive in themselves. So every pixeled photography in itself is an archive with discrete archival elements in it. When explaining a photographic plate showing articles coming from China, Henry Fox Talbot, in his publication The Pencil of Nature in 1844, pointed out that a whole cabinet of a collection might be depicted on paper by this technology in less time than it would take him to make a written inventory. Soon after its invention, photography has been used to extend the archival or library order. Adapting and modifying Marshall McLuhan's major thesis on media culture, the message of the traditional storage agency archive has been the typographic world of alphabetic records, the symbolic order of administration, with the discreteness of elementary units privileging analytic reading and classificatory listing. This is the nature of the alphabet, which used to be the central writing system of the archive. But since the end of the 19th century, a new type of records, non-textual, emerged. The recordings of the physically real, indexical photography, phonography, and cinematography. And these are non-archival media insofar as they do not operate on the symbolic level like the alphabetically coded traditional textual record anymore. With digital photography, finally, the scriptural archive returns in a new sense as the symbolical order of the alphanumeric code, as always emphasized by Wilhelm Flusser. The completely coded image replaces signals, which is the nature of the analog photograph, by arbitrary symbols, which can be processed, that is, computed, mathematically and algorithmically. A digital photograph or any other document can thus be altered without almost leaving any trace of such manipulation. The practice of digital media draws our attention to the question of how the authority of information can be established or preserved in a new medium. The photographic archive is predominantly a structure, not its pictorial content. Thus, it is less about the photochemical evidence than about the metadata, the paratextuality, as Gerard Genet defines it, linking the analog signals to the symbolical regime of writing codes, which is the basis of the historiographical operation. On the one hand, photographic authenticity depends on its physical and semiotic indexicality. On the other hand, the photograph derives its authenticity from the structure of archival authority itself, which is contextual, situative authenticity, as pointed out by John Tagg yesterday. The culture of analog photography relies heavily on the archival model for its legitimacy. The shadowy presence of the archive authenticated the truth claims made for individual photographs, as Alan Sekula points out. Increasingly when contested with the flow of immaterial images within electronic mass media in the 20th century. The question of photographic authority is linked to the nature of archival temporalities or temporealities indeed. There are conflicting time regimes in the archive. On the one hand, it is meant to suspend time to transfer information for future memory, negentropically, in Sven Speaker's sense. On the other hand, it is subject to time at work, entropic processes, material decay. In a third temporal aspect, the speed of access, migration, and short-time memorial functions of the archive increases. The archival time of photography differs from the temporality of other analog storage media like phonography and cinematography. Electronic media, audio and videotape recording, for example, are different in every aspect. The almost immediate transmission of light, which happens in photography, is the reversal of what the permanent registering of light on photographically sensitive emulsions, the photographic negative, embodies. Electronic media transfer light rays electronically. Photographic chemistry registers these light frequencies. According to Roland Barthes, against the discourse of photographic knowledge, the studium, the punctum, the photographic punctum exists. This punctum is not just metaphysical or affective, but very literally the tracing of light rays themselves. The photographic record is the negentropical inscription of one moment of light into a carrier medium. The analog physicality of the photographic print and its cinematographic twin thus secures its status as historical record. In the use of photography as visual, and I want to insist on this, against all deconstruction of the photographic trace. There is a real event happening when light is being inscribed in photography, and this is an ultimate testimony. Media archaeologically, I would always insist on this against all deconstruction and postmodernist relativization. In the sense of photography as visual evidence from the past, an unarchival moment which escapes the symbolic order of archive-based historiography is the signature of photographic time. As described by Walter Benjamin as a genuine media archaeological quality, photography occasionally provides for a Proustian mémoire involontaire, which escapes all ideological manipulation, as an accidental flash of the real. It is in photography itself, notably in its temporal momentum, that the auratic moment resides. The camera lens, we discussed this yesterday afternoon, gives access to another evidence than is usually disclosed to the human eye. Thus, it opens a different kind of archive of the present. Benjamin called this the optical unconscious, which turns out to be radically technological. About such images, the human spectator learns only by means of the photographic apparatus, especially since the photographic apparatus does not by itself differentiate between the semantically significant and the asignificant in their reference. Its non-hermeneutic essence is the media archaeological virtue, not deficit, of photography as media technology. As coined by Charles Saunders Peirce by the term semiotic index, this is closer to the signal than to the sign, and rather a contingent pre-symbolic, thus unarchival trace. The regime of signals is radically unarchival. I insist the regime of the archive is the order of the symbolic. Talbot, whom I already mentioned, has been explicit in the introductory words to his publication, The Pencil of Nature, when he stresses that the photographic plates therein, quote, have been formed or depicted by optical and chemical means alone, and without the aid of anyone acquainted with the art of drawing, unquote. Talbot media archaeologically radicalized the techno-poetic rupture with the rhetoric of iconic mimesis. Photography, in this sense, is not about image reproduction, but about measuring physical light. As expressed by Talbot in 1844, and later rediscovered by Henri Bergson, about whom we learned yesterday as well, a picture divested of the ideas which accompany it and considered only in its ultimate physical nature is but a variety of light frequencies and shadows thrown upon chemically sensitive paper. Media theory is split between two different approaches to this photographic being. Media archaeologists describe the non-discursive practices of the techno-cultural archive, while media phenomenologists analyze how phenomena in various media appear to the human cognitive apparatus. that is, to the mind and senses. Roland Barthes' notorious identification of the two distinct qualities of photography as perceived by humans, the studium and the punctum, can be applied to archival times as well. While the media archaeological reading of the archive is distancing and biased by the techno-mathematical analysis, the techno-studium, not mistaking storage for memory or even remembrance, the phenomenological reading on the other side of the archive corresponds with the punctum, where miraculously something like a flash crossing and short-circuiting the temporal gap between the record from the past and its present reading happens. Different from the photograph record, which is storage medium as well, the photographic print, after having been chemically processed, does not depend on an operative apparatus to articulate its content, but can be processed by human perception immediately. It is there where the seduction of photography in the archive happens to us, the referential illusion of historicity, the image of a past moment almost as it actually happened, which is, of course, Leopold von Ranke's expression. The media archaeological gaze tries to resist this phantasmagory by looking at the temporality of the photographic medium itself. Let us imagine two photographs of a historical building, for example, in Warsaw, taken with the same camera, but at different times. One photograph shows the unrestored architecture, the other, more recently, shows its renewed state. As a medium, photography is indifferent against the temporality of its referent and the temporal change. Whatever is inscribed is radically present as a light event. Its historicity lies rather in the entropy of its own physical state. Against this, digital photography is even more radically atemporal, carrying the temporal trace not in its information, which is its binary essence, but in the hard and software into which this information is embedded. Digital photography, based on charge-coupled devices, is completely reversible and thus non-historical. Negentropically, digital photography does not count with the historical anymore, depriving them of their temporal indexicality by a translation of the image into mathematical, time-invariant topologies. That is why I say that the difference between analog and digital photography is so radical in terms of temporality and historicity. Mathematized space is radically ahistorical. Okay, fine. Then let's leave it like that.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Well, thank you for that forceful statement. Fundamental tension between the photograph as the coding of one moment of time and the ultimate testimony, as Wolfgang put it, of one moment of time, and the function of the archive as symbolic order. Well, we're going to try to follow the same format as yesterday, which will be to have each speaker and then have a question period immediately following that talk. So I open it up to questions. So, there is a question. Okay.
Yes, there is a question. I would like to elaborate maybe a little bit on the ways in which digital photography comes back to the scriptural nature of the archive as opposed to analog media.
To elaborate on this.
Yes.
Yes. analog photography, since being based on chemical physical processes, is in itself, of course, subject to physical entropy, which is the clearest sign of temporality, of decay. It carries a physical temporal trace in the scientific sense. Whereas the same photograph as a digitized photography cannot be historically traced anymore. As information, a digital photography is a mathematical function, which in itself has no historical trace, which you can identify. So mathematical space, digital photography is in a different time. It's time invariant, actually. It's more archival in the mathematical sense, and I would always extend the notion of the archive to the mathematical. Nothing is more archival than the mathematical regime. Or the archival regime itself is already a kind of mathematical, a logic order. But this is atemporal, and that is why I say that we should not mix the archive with the idea of memory anymore. It's a rule system, which is in the digital times more radically as mathematical rules, techno-mathematical rules than ever. And it's completely different from the idea of memory, historicity, past, or whatever we attach to the current broader use of the archive. So let us not confuse memory and the digital archive anymore. Yeah.
I guess I'd like to ask you about another category, which is not the collective memory, but the commons. The commons, which is not collective memory or common memory. And I mean, when you refer to Google, one of the striking things about that archive is that it is founded on a theft. And I don't mean that it raises questions of copyright with Google taking over images and books. I mean that its very structure is based on theft, in that when you Google, you don't search the internet. The internet would collapse if that was the case. You search a database copy of the internet. Yeah. So the very fundamental structure of the machinery and of the business model involves a theft. So my question would be, what are the possibilities then of resisting that theft and that capitalization and restoring a commons, which is not restoring a common memory? What can you imagine a politics of the archive that was based around the commons rather than collective common memory?
Well, the distribution of digitized photographies in the internet is not a theft of the analog photographers, I would say. It's not misusing the analog photographies, but they physically stay where they are. I would clearly separate the idea of the digital copy of an analog photography and the residence of the analog photography itself. So what you get on the internet by such image distribution is not the photograph. It's a mathematical function. It's what we. It's not. I would not even call it photography. I mean, I'm very radical on that. We yesterday. I will maybe just show the one image which I've brought. If you could activate it from the computer. Yeah, when we illustrate our talks here in a conference on photography, we show a lot of images. The photographer yesterday showed his photographies, but we see them from a beamer, which means they have been digitized. And I would say radically, this is not photography. It's not photography. Yeah?
No, yes, well, when Rosalind Krauss wrote down her theory of indexicality in '77, her example was a radiogram. That is not a photograph, but
yes,
an imprint on a negative.
Yeah.
And that's why I think indexicality describes perfectly the theoretical relation with the photogram. The problem is we never looked at negatives. We looked at prints, screens, and everything possible ways of transformations of this first imprint. And that's what we call photography. What do you think?
Mm. Yeah, I completely agree. May I just, as a last point, explain my one picture? Being so radical on the digital image and the mathematical space, I at least want to point out what are the creative, poetical chances of the digital image archive. And that's why I referred to a colleague of Sven's speaker in California, Santa Barbara, the media artist George Legrady. He created an artwork which was originally called A Pocket Full of Memory. Now it has extended to Cell Tango. It functions like this. You put an object which you carry in your pockets, you put it on a scanner, it's digitized, and then an algorithm, which is a self-organizing map, a sum, arranges those images according to similarity, which means it's completely non-iconological criteria. For example, color values, edges, or distinctive objects, shapes. Now this is a completely different way of organizing an archive, according to similarities, not exact classification. These self-organizing maps create a dynamic archive, and now this has been extended. You can, by your cell phone, you can send images you take to this data bank, and then the self-organizing map, this powerful unarchival algorithm, fits these new images into this collection according to criteria which are radically different from what art historians used to do or what humans used to do in photographic archives when they put in words, when they subject photographies to words, authors, subjects. This is done from the pixels themselves. Now this is such a radical alternative to the traditional classificatory archive, opening a new poetic world of how to navigate in disordered space. Order from disorder, or order in fluctuation. Now that is why I finally pointed, and you can look at it in the web, at George Legrady's work. Yes.
Well, I mean, you just mentioned the word poetic. Yeah? I mean, if we base this on Roman Jakobson's categories of what poetry is, then precisely an archive based on similarity would be a poetic archive.
It is. It is a poetic archive. And that's why this is one of the subtitles of our conference, isn't it? The politics and poetics of the archive.
But I wanted to say something else about John's remark about theft. I mean, that's, I think, an extremely interesting categorization of the archive. The archive is a form of systematic theft. That is, in every archive, you will be dealing with a form of pre-selected access to information. It is never the full picture. Yeah? You will always be dealing with systematized administrative procedures that pre-select sets of information which you can then access or not. Yeah? But in that sense, an archive is theft by definition, if you will. Yeah?
There's an insurrection from the back row, so please.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, I mean, thank you very much for the presentation, ask you to elaborate a little bit on the topic you have already touched answering the previous question, because as I understand what you have said, it's like the mathematized space and physical space are completely different realms, and then if we use authenticity in physical space, and authenticity is something that legitimizes the picture. So in mathematized space, as far as I can follow, we should use completely different legitimizing order or mood and or modality, and possibly, I would guess it would be true. I mean, it's like the truth and the authenticity are opposite like orders to legitimize, and it's got very deep consequences in terms of using images if the criteria is truth is different than if the criteria is authenticity. So could you please elaborate a little bit on this two different legitimizing orders as such?
Yes, I mean, you have expressed it well. We need new tools and methods and a new epistemology of authentication. It's not the physical trace anymore which authenticates the record, whether it's pictorial or textual. The classical archival regime depends really on the physical trace and on the original. That's what differentiates it from the library. The library consists of mass reproduced works. The book is not authenticized by being the one and only book, like the medieval manuscript. But the archive normally contains singular products where the authenticity is the material trace, which gets lost in digital as an information. And so we have to develop really a new, and now the archive comes in again. If we say the archive is not about content, but the archive is something like a structure, now we have to think of what is the new structure of authentication of a digital record. But in order to think this new challenge, which we can do, computer people and media theorists, and they're all ready to help on that, we have to get rid and to make a sharp discontinuity with the traditional archival idea, which so heavily depends on the physical trace. And I think we are a bit nostalgic. When we speak about the archive, we immediately think about this physical collection of material traces. Now this is the old archive. Maybe the new archive should not be called archive at all anymore, since the expression archive is semantically, culturally so heavily loaded that it hampers us to face the new challenges. But I love archives, so I'm careful.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Whatever the temporality of the archive, the temporality of the conference has its own rules. So thank you very much.